Hey, this is Jordy, founder of the Independent Surfer, and today we're going to discuss the age-old question of can you teach yourself to surf? The short answer really is yes, you can. There's a big but here, and we'll get into that in a moment. If you're considering wanting to teach yourself to surf, then we'll just jump straight into a few tips that will really help you, and maybe a little backstory to give you some sort of confidence that it will work. So let's start with the backstory. Like I actually taught myself to surf back in the day. Like back in the day, I'm not that old, but I kind of learned when I was probably around 13 or 14. And there wasn't really, or not that I knew of, but there weren't really any like surf instructors around or surf coaches or what have you, where I lived anyways. And so I kind of was just kind of grabbed a really small 511 like hard top surfboard that was kind of all beat up and stuff, and took that out and kind of just did my own thing out in the lineup. And it took me a long time to really become proficient with it. But in the end, like I consider myself to be able to surf pretty well now. But it just took really long. I think one of the hardest parts was probably just like catching and reading waves and understanding like whether or not I was doing the right thing on the board. It was pretty easy for me because by the time I had started learning to surf, I was really proficient with bodyboarding. I was doing it like kind of like pretty well. I was starting to do like rolls and ARSs and backflips and stuff like that. And so I already had a background of like being able to read and catch waves. And so by the time I got onto the surfboard, it was a lot easier for me because I didn't have to think too much about reading and catching waves. I just had to think about timing and then popping up on the surfboard. That's my first tip to you is, learning to surf is multifaceted, and part of it is reading and catching waves, and another whole literal like another sport of it is standing up on the surfboard. So my first tip would be, if you're trying to teach yourself to surf, is to practice the pop up at home, or at least make sure that you can pop up, go from lying down to standing up in your living room before you try and do it out in the water. Doing it in your living room with no outside distraction is one thing, and then being able to do it while trying to focus on catching waves, and then the board moving and waves moving and the instability of the board is a whole different ball game. So if you can't go from lying down to standing up very calmly and collectedly on flat ground, then you're going to have a really hard time in the water. So make sure that you practice your pop up, or at least make sure that you can pop up at home before you go out into the water. The next tip that I have for you, if you're like kind of considering learning to surf on your own, is that where you try and learn to surf is going to make a huge difference in your progress. So most people would suggest that you go and learn to surf at a beach break where there's like rolling whitewater and where you see other surf schools and stuff. But that's all fine and dandy for like the first few times you go and surf. But like at some point, you're going to want to progress. And so I would say that honestly, like a better approach, and this is how we teach people to surf, is to focus on the paddling and catching waves before you focus on popping up. Because you can just go into the whitewater, kind of stand on your board, turn your board around, lie down and catch a wave, and then stand up. But that's not really surfing. Like you're in the whitewater and you'll never be able to progress if that's your approach. At some point, you're going to have to paddle out to try and catch a green wave anyway. So if you're considering surf spots, like what you really want to look for are surf spots with really small, gentle rolling waves that are usually kind of protected from the open ocean and actually have a reef bottom. I'm going to explain why in a moment. So again, you can take that old approach of going to the whitewater, going to surf school or whatever, or being where the surf schools are, catching waves in the whitewater at a beach break. But when you try and then go out into the lineup, going to a beach break versus a reef break is going to be much more difficult to get out. Specific reef breaks, in any case, like obviously some reef breaks, like Pipeline, for example, a famous reef break, is like really heavy and you would never ever go and consider learning to surf there. it would be very difficult to get out. But waves like Waikiki, for example, in Hawaii, these are gentle rolling waves with large bodies of water called a channel next to where the waves are breaking, and that allows you to get out into the lineup or out past the breaking waves a lot easier, versus trying to do this at a beach break is much more difficult because that area to get out into the lineup is much less defined. So it'll make it a lot harder for you to get out into the lineup, versus going to a reef break is much easier for you to get out into the lineup. And I know, like, from a safety perspective, it might seem dangerous because there's a rocky bottom versus a sand bottom and, walking and stuff, but like surfing is mostly paddling. And so you need to hone your paddling skills anyway. Going to a reef break with really small, gentle rolling waves, the chances of you touching the bottom and hurting yourself are actually really slim. You shouldn't be scared of surfing reef breaks because of this like stigma around it being dangerous. It's really not dangerous. Like we do pretty much all our lessons for brand new beginners at reef breaks because they offer a very defined structure. Like it's easier to read waves, and there's also, as I said, the channel next to waves, which make it easier for you to hang out and rest, and get out into the lineup. Cool. So then the next tip that I would suggest when it comes to teaching yourself to surf is that obviously you want to be watching YouTube videos, which I guess you are already. There's going to be a lot of information out there, and it's important for you to also take all that information with a bit of a grain of salt, because I'm going to get into that in a moment. But so watching YouTube videos, practicing your pop-up at home, get comfortable with paddling, because most of the work that you're going to be doing is paddling, and try and focus on one thing at a time in the lineup. So if your goal is to catch and read waves, like that should be your first goal. First of all, should be like paddling the surfboard. Then your next goal should be catching and reading waves. And then finally, once you're comfortably catching waves regularly, you can consider popping up. And the pop-up, I would say, like, you would practice at home while you're doing those other things in the water, so that by the time you get to the point of doing the pop-up, you can consider, you'll actually be, sorry, not consider, but you'll actually be really good at doing the pop-up because you've had so much training at home. It's one of the few elements of surfing that you can practice in a controlled environment. Whereas like paddling and paddling and catching waves, you kind of need to go in the ocean to practice that, versus the pop-up becomes very habitual. Like when you pop up in the water, you're not thinking about it. Your mind is elsewhere. You're thinking about catching waves, you're thinking about paddling, you're thinking about turning the surfboard, but the pop-up becomes pretty habitual. So just practice it at home. As I was saying before, like take all this information you're seeing on the internet with a grain of salt, because a lot of information is pretty generalized, and the barrier to entry to kind of become a surf instructor is very low. And there's a lot of like misinformation. So like, and people don't like, I feel like sometimes people will say something like, oh, you need to just jump up to your feet and ride the board. And I think that's the first thing I'm going to get into with like the cons of teaching yourself to surf. Surfing is a kind to ballet in that like you need to have the right technique in order to make progress. So in the beginning, how you pop up doesn't matter. As long as you can get to your feet, it's fine. But then once you get to a certain point where you want to drop down in board size, or when you start to want to turn the board, for example, and can have control over the board, like where you're standing on the board is going to make a huge difference to how much control you have over the board. And if you can't identify that, or if you don't have anything giving you or anybody giving you that sort of feedback, it can take a really long time to learn to surf. And I'd say like almost worse than not having that feedback is having that feedback, but then somebody kind of giving you the wrong information, or somebody giving you information that maybe they think is right, but they don't fully explain what they mean. And so you might go ahead and think one thing, and then, maybe that principle that they discussed with you doesn't always apply. Because in surfing, like, it's not very, like, surfing isn't binary. It's not like there's one thing that's right and there's one thing that's wrong. It's pretty fluid. Like, there's a lot of things that you can do to help you, and there's also a lot of things that you can do that will help you now, but you'll need to change as you get better. It's pretty dynamic in that way. So almost worse than not having feedback is having misinformation or having like bad feedback where somebody's kind of giving you the wrong advice. So really take it with a grain of salt, question somebody's um, way of giving you feedback or what they're telling you so that you fully understand, so that you're not kind of going down a path that's going to stop you from progressing. If I draw back to my own experience, when I was learning to surf, like if I had somebody teaching me to surf, I think I would have learned to surf much quicker. Like I would have gotten much further in my progress. So that is probably the biggest con with teaching yourself, is not having that direct feedback to know that you're doing the right thing. Because you can go and scour the internet and get all this information about technique and all this stuff, but like to actually know whether or not you are doing the technique correctly, you might understand it, but to know whether you're doing it or not, you really need somebody who's not qualified but experienced to be like, hey, you popped up with your feet too far forward, and so when you try and turn the board, even though you're using the right technique, you're not standing in the right place on the board. That's just like an example, a very common example of how nuanced it is. Like you might be using the right technique to pop up, but your nose is diving every single time because when you do pop up, you're popping up a little bit too far forward on your board. And unless you are, unless you're getting that feedback via video review or via coach, it can take a long time for you to realize these things. Another con that I would say with teaching yourself to surf is that you could very easily end up in a situation where you're not like not adhering to rules, but like you are being a little bit of a nuisance in the lineup. And this is just understanding surf etiquette. And I don't mean a nuisance, like I just mean that like if you don't understand how the dynamics of how lineups work and how people move around in the lineup, and you're getting in people's way and stuff, like some people really don't mind, and obviously as a normal human, you would hope that they have some sort of empathy or like courtesy or understanding that you're just learning. But a lot of surfers out there kind of forget that, and they can be pretty aggressive towards you, especially if you're a beginner, and in their way. So and not only in their way, maybe taking waves where you shouldn't, so on and so forth. So really just understand like etiquette and how the lineup works before you just like jump straight into it. That's pretty much it, I guess. I mean, we could talk about this for hours and hours, but at the end of the day, you can teach yourself to surf. The gist is that it's just going to take much longer. And so if you're tired of teaching yourself to surf, or if you really want to speed up that process, we're here to help, whether it's through video reviews online or joining us at one of our surf retreats. Our goal is to get you to achieve really realistic goals within a week. All you need is a week with us, and I'm pretty sure you'll make tons of progress. So I hope to see you at our surf retreat, or maybe even in a video review someday.